Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. Um, in the meantime, welcome. Oh, I'm seeing lots of familiar faces. Very nice to see you all. We'll just, usually it takes a minute or two for the rapid entry to slow down. Um, all right, Kristen, why don't we get started? Oh, now I can't see anybody. Hold on one second. There we are. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Welcome to tonight's narrative medicine rounds. We are very excited. This event, I think maybe some of you know, was rescheduled from November. So hopefully some of you who meant to come then have come back, and some of you who didn't even know about it are here now. Um, I just will do a very quick intro and then we'll get started. I'm Nellie Hermann. I think many of you know me. I'm work in the narrative medicine program for a long time, the creative director. I teach fiction writing. Um, and I have hosted many rounds, but not for a while. So I'm a little rusty. So forgive me if I stumble. And I'm also a huge fan of our guest tonight. So I'm extra excited about it. Just a couple orders of business, which many of you already know because we're used to Zoom at this time, but please do keep your microphone muted, just for purposes of ease of everything. And we ask that you, while Garth and I are talking, just keep your chat interactions to a minimum because the chat will not be monitored. But I will, once we get closer to the Q&A portion of the event, I will invite you to put your own questions into the chat. And at that point, please do. And then I will look to those to ask Garth your questions when it is time. So just to give you a quick official bio of our guest tonight, and then I will say a little bit more about my own feelings. Garth Greenwell is the author of What Belongs to You, which won the British Book Award for Debut of the Year, was longlisted for the National Book Award, and was a finalist for many other awards, including the PEN Faulkner and the LA Times Book Prize. His second work of fiction, Cleanness, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and a New York Times notable book. His new novel, which we'll talk about tonight, is Small Rain, which is also, by the way, currently a finalist for the PEN Faulkner Award, which is very exciting. His nonfiction appears widely, and he writes regularly about culture for his Substack newsletter, To a Green Thought. Highly recommend that if those of you who are not yet readers. He's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Harold D. Versal Award for Prose Style from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and he is currently a distinguished writer in residence at NYU. In For full disclosure, I want to tell everyone that Garth is a dear friend of mine, but I was a fan before we were friends. We actually became friends because I literally wrote him a fan letter after reading his novel Cleanness. And I feel like it's testament to his goodness and kind heart that he then wanted to become friends with someone who had fawned over his work as I did. But anyway, so I truly, even though I know Garth, I'm still like very much, I think it's not exaggeration to say he's one of our greatest living writers right now. And a true honor to have him here with us. And when I read this novel, I just was so excited because I was like, oh, now we can bring him to narrative medicine and have him talk to our people. So very curious to hear later in the program how many of you have already read this book and how you have engaged with it, because it is, a rare novel that speaks directly to healthcare and to our work. Oh yeah, I meant to say to look to the chat for official details about Narrative Medicine Lounge, our monthly speaker series, and also any other. Kristen is putting other things you might want to know about the event. So I guess that's all I need to say for now. Garth, I'm gonna let you take it away, and then I know pretty quickly you and I will start. I have all kinds of questions. I don't think I'm going to have time to even ask you half of what I have written down here, but we'll see how it goes.
Great. Thank you so much, Nellie. Thank you for the introduction. I am also a huge fan of Nellie Hermann, so it's not just a one-way street, and I'm really happy to be with you guys here tonight. I'm going to read just a short reading, and then there might be another short reading as Nellie and I talk with each other. And I'm just going to read the very opening of the book, so I don't think you need any introduction. So this is just the first couple of pages of Small Rain. They asked me to describe the pain, but the pain defied description. On a scale of 1 to 10, it demanded a different scale. It was like someone had plunged a hand into my gut and grabbed hold and yanked, trying to turn me inside out and failing and trying again. Like that, while somebody else kneed me in the groin. For 8 hours on Saturday, I said. On Saturday, someone interrupted. I was surrounded by people at this point, some busy with IVs or electrodes, but most, it seemed, just looking at me, asking me to answer questions I had already answered, wanting to hear everything afresh. In my own words, they said, not the words they had heard from others, the words that had summoned them here from all corners of the huge hospital I was lucky to have almost in my backyard, just a mile from my house. On Saturday, and you waited until today to come in, the voice said, you must be the stoic type. Stoic or stupid, I thought. For 8 hours, I had lain on the sofa in the room where I write, where I spend most of my time reading or writing, though really I hadn't lain. I had crouched on all fours. I had curled myself, clutching, I had curled into myself, clutching my stomach. I had held my balls as if to shield them in my hand. It didn't occur to me to go to the hospital, in part because for months I had thought of hospitals and doctors, of medical offices of all kinds, as the last places one would go for help, as dangerous places. In the pandemic, the likeliest places to get infected. Everyone I knew felt the same. Only if you were dying would you go to the hospital, and it didn't occur to me that I could be dying. I wonder if anyone ever imagines they're dying even as it happens, or if anyone imagines it without being sick for a long time. People like me, I mean, who have always been more or less healthy and more or less strong, hale, as my grandparents said, as my mother sometimes says or said until now, counting her blessings, all of her children, hardy and hale. I didn't imagine anything as I lay there, as I crouched or curled. Nothing occurred to me. When I try to remember my thoughts, they come broken and scrambled. I became a thing without words in those hours, a creature evacuated of soul. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Garth. Yeah, I might ask you to read some other passages as we talk, but we'll
Sure.
see. And it's a great to just hear the opening again. I wonder, just as a very to start in a super general place, tell us just how the book came about, however you.
Yeah, sure. I am the kind of writer, all of my books begin because something has happened either to me or sort of in my world, in my proximity, that leaves me utterly bewildered. And I've said many times talking about this book, this is not autobiography. I don't even really like to talk about it as autobiographical. I think of it as a work of fiction through and through. But it's true that I underwent a medical crisis similar to what the narrator of the novel undergoes. And in the wake of that crisis, I felt that sort of something major, sort of profound had happened to me that I didn't have the tools um, with which to think about. And it's when I have that feeling that there's something I need to think about and I don't have the tools to think about it with, that's when I turn to art and when I feel like I know there's a book I have to write.
Mhm. Yeah, I was going to ask you, but I think I'll put this question like just in case we have time or if maybe someone else wants to ask you about it. But I did have noted here that all of your books have the same narrator and you know, I've heard you talk before about autofiction, and I always find it really interesting to hear you talk about that, and also just generally the idea of having a continuous narrator, no matter whether the project has anything to do with one's self, is
Right.
really interesting to me. So that's a question that I am interested in. However, I'm going to put a pin in it because I do think it might derail the whole rest of our conversation. Um,
It's true.
but similar on the similar vein, knowing that the book in some way was tied up with your own real life, I'm curious if you can say, I mean, it's a big question, so I realize it's not an easy one to answer, but just generally, like, how do you give it, when you're working, when you're really in the process of writing the book, how do you give shape to something that you're like, how did you decide how to structure it, how to give it a beginning, middle, end, how when you were moving through it, if that is even answerable?
Yeah, so I mean, I am a writer who works very intuitively. I know very little at the beginning of a project, and the process of writing is really a process of discovery. But those questions about structure were especially anxious with this book, in part because, my first two books are very much books in parts, and I wrote each of them I sort of tricked myself into writing them because I thought, at no point did I think I'm writing a novel. I thought I'm writing a scene or I'm writing a little section. And it was only, especially with the first book, it was only really late in the process that I sort of realized I had written a book. And that was really helpful. I don't think I would ever have been able to begin if I had sort of started with the idea for my first book, I'm going to write a novel. I find that just a really terrifying idea. This third book was the first book that I did sort of begin. I knew, okay, I am going to be writing a novel. And I was especially anxious about structure because I knew it was a given of the novel, that it was going to be structured by the time that the narrator spends in the cardiovascular ICU, which is like 10 or 12 days. And I knew it was going to be a novel in which the primary action, sort of, I knew it was going to move forward in time through this hospital visit. And that the primary action, I mean, the protagonist of the book was basically never going to get out of bed. And that seemed really challenging. It's in terms of sort of trying to structure, like, how do you make that experience dramatic? And the experience he has of illness, which is like narratively really unsatisfying in the way that I think, illness often is. This seemingly random thing happens to him. He doesn't understand it at all. They never figure out why it happened. It shouldn't have happened to him. It's a freak occurrence. And then this isn't really a spoiler. Like at the end, when he leaves the hospital and he sort of says, "But what's going to happen to me?" They say, "We'll wait and see." We don't know. So there's just this way in which, like, that is a super unsatisfying story. And yet, also, that is the story of an awful lot of illness. And this guy leaves the hospital knowing that his life has been changed, that his life is going to be different from now on, and that he's going to have to, resign himself to sort of consciously, explicitly knowing and accepting something that is always true, which is our lives are radically contingent. And, there is no guarantee that the life I know as my life today will still be my life tomorrow or the day after that. And somehow he has to figure out how to continue with the various projects of his life, which include art making and include a love relationship, in that state of contingency. And so, in some way, I knew that that was the story of the novel, but how to make that dramatic was really daunting to me at first. And I mean, I really wasn't sure I was going to be figure my way sort of into and out of it.
And do you, I I mean, I guess in a way you knew going in what the story was, as you just said, and sort of the goal of where you wanted to end up. But I know from speaking with you that you, as you just said, also like writing is a process of discovery. So I'm curious about the melding of those two things in the process of writing the book. That's not a really fully coherent question, but I don't know. Does that spark anything for
Yeah,
you?
no, sure. I mean, it's true that, I mean, and that was another way that writing this book was really distinct from writing my first two books. You know, like my first novel, when I began it, I had no idea where it was going. I had no idea like what the final pages would be. And in this novel, I mean, it's an exaggeration to say I knew what the final pages would be, but I did know that there was the structure of this hospital visit. And like basically, I knew the big beats in terms of like the procedures he was going to undergo. And so, like, in some sense, that was the spine of the plot. But that's not really the drama of the book. You know, the drama of the book is largely internal. I mean, to me, the central question of the book is, you know, this is about a guy who in his early 40s, you know, sort of decades before he had thought he would have to confront these kinds of questions, is forced to ask himself, okay, if this is it, what has my life been worth? Like, what has the value of my life been? What has it added up to? And so, in some sense, you know, it is a novel about his whole life and the way that that was going to be navigated and the way that sort of his own, the way that this puts pressure on his life and sort of puts the pressure of mortality on these projects, like the project of art making, the project of loving someone, in a way that is going to reveal to him, you know, whether the value he has hoped they have is a real value. That's the drama of the book. And that's a drama of the mind, you know, that's a drama of thinking and how that drama is structured, which is really the narrative of the book. That was all sentence by sentence. You know, I often talk about the fact that I think of sentences not as containers for thought, but as tools for meaning and also as kind of navigation devices. And I felt that very much with this book, that sort of, even if I had these sort of external beats of like, he's going to get an A line placed, he's going to get a PET scan, he's going to do X, Y, or Z. Um, that is really secondary to the sort of interior drama, which for me is you know, in a sort of counterintuitive way where the action is.
Sorry, I muted myself because of the doorbell. Yeah, actually, maybe that is a good segue to a a a series of questions, really. But I was they're at the end of my list, but I actually think they're so important that maybe we'll do them now. And it will involve you reading maybe a little bit more. But
Sure.
as you were just talking about, I mean, I want to ask you, of course, about the art, the centrality of art in the book. Can you hear that? If is that okay, good. I'm on the first floor, so every time anyone comes in the building, there's a loud buzz. This book, of course, is uh, on some level a love story with between these two men, but it's also, I think, I read a kind of love story to art, or at least that's one element of what is being wrestled with throughout the book, the question of what this, as you just said, what this means for this narrator. Is this worth hanging your life on? And early in the book, there's a um, I'm not going to make you read this part, but there's a passage This is when the phrase "small rain" comes up in on page 46, and the narrator says, "All art is a message." And then there's also a line about, his life had seemed a full life and also a wasted life. That both those things are true at once, I think is you part of what you want to make clear, maybe that it's not one or the other, it's both. And then if you would maybe read, just because it speaks to what you were just saying, this is on page 116. Just, I don't know exactly where, maybe just that last paragraph. And then I will ask the rest of the question.
Sure. Yeah, so this is a passage. This is in some ways kind of the darkest moment he has in the hospital. So when he is finally, so because he's in America, he goes to the emergency room. He waits for like 5 or 6 hours in the waiting room before he's seen. And then when they finally do a CT scan, sort of things become very urgent and he's rushed, and there are all these doctors around him. And one of the first things that one of the vascular surgeons says to him in the emergency room where he's being examined is, "You could die from this." And there's a sense in that moment that like a terrible taboo has been broken, and the narrator can feel the sort of disapproval of everyone else in the room. And from that moment on, he feels like everyone is lying to him and that they're all sort of sugarcoating what's happening. No one's telling him how serious things are. And finally, one night, the doctor on call or the vascular surgeon on call in the ICU, who it turns out is someone the narrator has met sort of casually. He's this gay guy from town that they've sort of been at a dinner party together, recognizes his name on the list of patients and comes to see him and sort of gives it to him straight and tells him these really scary figures. And then as soon as this guy leaves, the narrator does what you should never do. He Googles and he like reads all these scary things about what's happening to him and life expectancy. And it just really scares him. And this is where those thoughts leave him. I was being stupid, I thought, or really I had been stupid before, stupid to have let myself be lulled. Oh, he's been thinking about the fact, sorry. He's been thinking about the fact that he's wondering about when he came to believe in a future, because he grew up in the American South before protease inhibitors. Um, and he thinks about his first experiences of gay sex, which were of cruising in this park, and how he had sort of his life had seemed to present him a kind of bargain that like he could either be chaste or he could be condemned. And that by having sex at all as a 14, 15, 16-year old, he was just accepting the fact that he was going to have a short life. And he's been wondering sort of, when did that change? When did he buy into a future? And he's also been thinking about the fact that it was just pure chance that he didn't get sick. So this is the end of those thinking, of that sort of train of thought. I was being stupid, I thought, or really I had been stupid before, stupid to have let myself be lulled. I had been wiser as a child. There were no guarantees. It was ridiculous to imagine life at 60 or 70, to think of the future as a broad passage and avenue, when really it was a narrow corridor of slamming doors. But that isn't true either. Planning for the future or living for the moment, nobody knows how to live. There's no way to know. Anything anyone says is bullshit, entirely arbitrary, true or false by chance. There are no arts of living, I thought. I looked to the window, though the shade was drawn. Beyond it was the tower where I knew children's oncology was housed, Olivia had told me when I asked her earlier in the day. Why should I feel aggrieved? I thought, if you want injustice, look there. Dying at 45 or 50 isn't unjust. So you haven't seized every moment of your life. Who has? People die young every day. I said to myself, younger than you, why act like it's such a tragedy? But none of it helped. I was aggrieved, more than aggrieved. I felt enraged, not just at some abstraction, at fate or death or chance, but at actual concrete beings, at the doctors for whom I was not an infinitely cherishable bundle of pathos and need, but an interesting case, at the nurses I heard chattering through the day at their desk outside my room, at absolutely everyone not facing what I faced, what I felt I was facing, even at L. L is his partner. The closeness I had felt with him earlier was gone now there was a great gulf, and I was on one side of it alone. If I died, what would I be for him but a story? Not even my own story, but a segment of his, larger or smaller. I would be something he lived past, something he got over, an elegy's inspiration, maybe. Where did it come from, that rage? And where did it go? After a moment, as suddenly as it came, I watched it as it went, merely afraid again. The great banality, I repeated to myself, commoner than dirt, inspiring a scale of feeling that was ridiculous the moment it passed, as was true of all the immensities of love and oceans and the night sky filled with stars. Everyone is ridiculous encountering them for the first time, when feeling swells to match them and is laughable for trying, grotesque with bigness. Why should death be any different? Where is your philosophy now? I ask myself. But human beings aren't ever philosophical, I don't think, not really. At least I was the opposite of philosophical, a minuscule, crouching thing, a bit of matter, terribly afraid, utterly insignificant, the entire world.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I hope it's okay that I sort of brought us to the maybe the darkest moment of the book, but it felt important to me for some reason I'm not totally sure of to to sh to show that passage maybe before I bring us to the other passage, which is um, later in the book. This is at the beginning of part four. Um, we have a long section devoted to a poem. And I want to ask you about that in general. And then, but before we get to just talking about it in general, I wondered because it did feel to me like perhaps these passages in a way are the heart of the book. I wondered if you might read a little bit from that section as well. And I'm thinking particularly of perhaps, I mean, what I thought, and you, of course, read us what you want, but I had thought maybe the paragraph that starts at the bottom of 183, that long
Sure.
paragraph there.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So this is just to set it up a little bit. This is the weirdest thing in the book, and it's also like by far my favorite thing in the book. Even though like I knew that it was going to make a lot of people mad. All of my books, there's in each of my books, there's something that's like obviously a really wrong choice. Like in my first book, the first book is in three sections, and the middle section is like a 48-page single paragraph, which obviously is wrong. Like obviously it's going to make a lot of people mad. And yet, I am not at all a confident writer. Like I second and triple guess everything. And yet in each book, that thing that is obviously wrong is the one thing that I am sure is right. And I sort of will defend it and insist on it. And in this book, it's the way that this fourth section, the book is in five sections, and then there's a little coda. And the fourth section begins with this like really long essay on a poem, which is it's a very short poem by George Oppen, one of my favorite poets. Um, and you know, it's quite separate from the rest of the book. I mean, the book, it's a novel, it's narrative, and this section is really not narrative. I mean, you could almost take it out and sort of say, here's like an academic essay on this poem. And the reason it's there is that, so much of this book is about, this is a guy who has gambled his life on the idea that art can fill a life up with meaning and with a kind of moral value. And I felt that, and as I said at the beginning, sort of this experience of near death, of the possibility of death, puts a lot of pressure on that gamble. Like he's going to figure out if he's won or lost, or that's not exactly true. But anyway, it feels like those are the stakes. And, I felt that I needed in the book to try to show what it means to, for instance, read a poem with your whole life and to have your life be made out of all the poems you've read. And so I knew that I needed this hugely intense, close reading of a poem. And so, yeah, I'll read just this one paragraph that comes kind of in the middle of this very close reading of this poem. Um, he's just thought like, which is something else art can do. It can be a laboratory for thinking, for trying out ideas, not just abstractly, but feelingly, so that we can live with them and see them through. And not just ideas, faculties too, ways of being. If it's true what Kant says about the kingdom of ends, I used to say to my students, if it's true that standing in an ethical relation to another means recognizing that their life has exactly the same value as my life, as the life of those I love, which is to say immeasurable value, boundless value, if each life, even if we say human life, bracketing off that whole set of questions, problems about the exceptionality of human life vis-a-vis other sentient life, in turn bracketing off the problem of sentience, of how we measure or judge it, how we know it's there. If every human life makes a claim upon the world for resources, possibility, regard, love that is infinite in its legitimacy, if each of the billions of human lives has that much value, then of course we can't bear to live in that kingdom in the full awareness of all that value. In the same way, our bodies filter out the innumerable bits of data our senses take in that endless stream, filter them so we can function, so we can perceive any particular thing. So maybe our moral senses, if we can speak of moral senses, have to filter out data too, have to blind us to value. Just imagine, I would say to my students, just imagine what it would be like to try to see each person you pass in a day, to recognize them, their value, to cherish them as any adequate relation would demand they be cherished. Imagine granting to each of their sufferings the priority you grant your own suffering. Even if we limited this to the people we see, to our actual encounters, leaving out of it the billions of lives that can only ever be abstractions to us, the faces we will never see, even then it would be utterly debilitating. It would make life impossible. Even the thought of it is unbearable as the thought of all we betray in failing it. Maybe we need the idea of saints because we need to believe there is some category of person adequate to the demands of others whose eye can be on the sparrow. I don't know. If so, it's a category that excludes me. But that's the power of a frame, I would tell them. To take a bit of the world, a person or a sparrow, to make a boundary within which we can establish that relation that is the only acceptable relation, in which we can see all that there is to see and feel all that there is to feel, which is what makes me think that the disciplined attention of art is a moral discipline, even when the content of that morality isn't obvious, in the way Cézanne paints an apple, say, or the bull that gathers the apples, the hundreds of strokes he makes, each an act of seeing, a judgment, each an attempt to activate in us that awareness we nearly always shut down. And even within the frame, this awareness is fragile, which is something else I love in Oppen's poem. It's truth-telling, though also it's something I only saw after years of reading it, after decades. And if a leaf sparkle, that's a line from the poem, and if a leaf sparkle, it's the poem's first verb conjugated not in the indicative, but the subjunctive, not sparkles, but sparkle. It isn't stating a fact, but suggesting a possibility. It's an acknowledgement of the contingency of the act of attention the poem commemorates, the contingency of our faculty of caring, I mean, of attending to the world, of tending to it. Why does one leaf sparkle? It is the perfect word, I realize, the precise word, an intermittent light. It conveys contingency too. Why does one leaf sparkle and not another, one sparrow claim our attention? Why do we love what we love? Why does so much fail to move us? Why does so much pass by us unloved? Little sparrow, round and sweet. That's the first line of the poem.
Oh, thank you so much. So, so gorgeous. Wow.
Oh, thanks, Nellie.
There's so much in this whole section that I mean, obviously we don't have time to read the whole section, but when I was rereading it this time, I felt like, oh, I mean, it's funny because it's like, yeah, it's the part of the book that's going to make people mad maybe, but it also feels to me like this is the book. This is the heart of the book here.
Yeah.
And this idea that he comes to in these pages, I mean, there's a few pages earlier, there's the phrase devotion to the actual, which I love so much and sort of represented in this passage. And then there's also a moment where he compares it to the hospital, this idea of all these data points that have been taken out of his body that actually, I think the line is like, they don't actually touch me, like
Yeah.
the me is untouched by all these data points. And so such an interesting, it's hard for me not to just ramble on this, but it's such an interesting series of things going on there. This idea of the specificity and the devotion to the specificity, almost as a philosophy of life, right? And is in a lot of ways what happens in healthcare and when someone cares for another human being. And yet, at the same time, there is a sort of removal. And this was a whole other question I had for you, by the way, is like a theme that is in all of your work is the question of what it means to be human. You frequently examine and use that word human. So again, this idea of like I'm rambling now, but I think it is very much also like what we think about in narrative medicine and a lot of the questions that get asked in our classes and like what is this all for and why are we in healthcare at all and can art actually does art actually matter to any of this? Um, so I'm not going to even attempt to make a question at the end of that statement, but
Sure.
just to say, I mean, I guess one question I might ask, I don't know, and I think I heard you be asked this at another event, but well, that's not a fair question. Never mind. I was going to ask you to like actually philosophize about like does art really matter? And I don't think you should do that.
Oh,
Um,
well, I don't mind.
I think
I can do
I
that.
think you've done it here on these pages. So,
Yeah, I mean, really, that is the whole argument for the book. And this essay, I do feel like it's sort of like my vindication of the humanities, my vindication of the arts as a way of being, and as a way of being that is more encompassing of our humanness than a lot of the more sort of instrumental reasony ways of being. But as you say, it's always a balance, I mean, because like the book is very much about, yeah, or the relationship between different kinds of attention, and the fact that he is the focus of so much attention in the hospital and his body is forced to produce all of this data that it's never produced before. Like no one has measured his urine before. No one has kept a running measurement of his blood pressure before. All of this information that is specific to him. And yet much of it, and certainly, or much of the way that that information is processed, feels like it depersonalizes him. And he becomes just hyper attuned in the hospital. And in part, this is because, as the opening makes clear, this is happening during the pandemic, pre-vaccine. So, the isolation of an ICU is intensified by the fact that, like, he can only have one visitor a day and only for like an hour or two. And, he's just really profoundly alone. And he becomes hyper attuned to how the different people providing him care treat him. And he becomes immensely grateful. A lot of that care is, as I say, depersonalizing. And a lot of the sort of surgeons, they treat him as a piece of faulty machinery. And this is a complicated thing. On one hand, if like treating me like a piece of faulty machinery is going to allow you to save my life, by all means, please do it. But there's also something, kind of devastating when you are facing, something that you've never faced before, something that is going to radically change your life, something that may end your life, and then to be treated as machinery. There's something devastating about that. And so he becomes just immensely grateful for the tiniest gestures. Like early in the book, one of the nurses just touches his ankle, and he realizes it's the first time anyone has touched him without there being a kind of instrumental purpose, like a touch that is just a human touch. And it feels like this extraordinary recognition. And that was interesting to me, you know? And this question of sort of, I mean, because as I say, the whole book is kind of almost, I don't know, almost like a thought experiment around this question of sort of, can art fill up a life with value? And, I'm not sure. Well, I guess I do think the book provides an answer to that, but it's a pretty complicated answer. So that fourth section of the book, um, it begins with this long essay on a poem, which just gets so granular. And so, in part, is kind of an homage. My first literary education was in poetry, and I had the extraordinary privilege of working with people like Helen Vindler, one of the great readers of poetry in the English language, and James Langenbach and Carl Phillips and Jory Graham. I got this extraordinary education in reading a poem. And so it's kind of an homage to that, but just paying attention to the smallest details, trying to see how dense a verbal artifact can be with meaning. And then at the end of that chapter, there's kind of the most dramatic event in the book, which is the narrator undergoes a PET scan. And as all of you, of course, know, a PET scan, you're in this tube for basically an hour. And he's totally unprepared for what happens to him. They ask him beforehand, are you claustrophobic? And he says, no, he's never been claustrophobic. But wow, he has a panic attack in this tube. And to try to keep himself from, he feels like he's just going to scream and start struggling. And that feels like the utter loss of personhood. And holding on to personhood has been a kind of crucial dilemma and act through all of these days he spent in the hospital. And to try to hold on to his humanness, to not become a kind of panicked animal screaming in this tube. He tries to recite poems to himself. And, he spent his whole life memorizing poems. He recites poems to himself to fall asleep, these poems that are companions to him. He's talked earlier in the book about the poem, about carrying around poems through your lives and how they enrich your life. And they're a kind of accoutrement of the self, as one of his teachers said to him. It's a quote from Helen Vindler, although she's not named. And in this tube, in this panic attack, he reaches out for poetry and discovers that poetry isn't there. All of these poems that he's been memorizing his whole life, they're just gone. They scatter. He can't sort of bring any of them. None of them come to his aid. And so, in some sense, that scene is asking existentially something that the essay at the beginning of the chapter has asked intellectually, which is, can poetry help us live? And the answer that scene seems to deliver is no. You know, in this moment of absolute existential need, he reaches out for poetry, and poetry is not there, except he realizes, sort of as he's, approaching the end of this process, he realizes that, like, below his consciousness, he has been repeating a phrase to himself. And that phrase has been naked rock, which are the two last words of the Oppen poem he examines at the beginning of the chapter. He's been saying again and again to himself, naked rock, naked rock, naked rock. And he realizes that he calls it like the smallest possible patch of stable ground. And, you know, that the fact that he has been able to repeat those words to himself actually has been saving. And so, and the fact that they're not his words, the fact that they're Oppen's words, that somehow they convey to him that, like, another human presence has inhabited this abyss of panic and lostness he has been experiencing. And so the answer to the question, can art help us live, is no, except.
Mhm.
And in that except, in that like tiny exception to the huge no, that is the question of what art can do for us, like that is actually, for this narrator, that is all salvation, that is all humanity. So that's the answer to the question, and it's a complicated answer. And I don't know if that will be my answer 10 years from now. It wasn't my answer 10 years ago. But, like, for now, I did try in that chapter. I wanted to try to answer that question, can art help us live? And that's the truest answer I could give.
It feels like, I mean, and it feels very satisfying as a reader too, getting to that
Oh,
naked
good.
rock line. I felt like, okay, there is, yeah. Anyway, you said it much more than I can. I want to invite people to start, if you do have questions you want to ask, to put them in the chat. I will do my best to ask some of them. We don't have much time, and of course I have like 15 more questions to ask, but I will ignore my own and try and ask some of yours. um, well, I'll just ask the first one that just came up. At what point in creating this is from Marcia Childress. At what point in creating this book did you choose to make its story map deeply and beautifully onto the anonymous medieval English poem, O Western Wind?
Oh, thank you for that question. Pretty early on, one of the things I knew early on in the book was that I wanted the book to have lots of little meditations on art. I remember saying to someone, it was actually, this is kind of funny. It was Sheila Heti, who was complaining, who's a wonderful writer, any of you who haven't read it. And I mean, a book that I think is a profound book about, I don't know if medicine, but about the body. Her book Motherhood, I think, is just a absolute terrific novel about being I don't know, an animal. And she had said something, she was complaining about a book, and she was like, oh, it's so much about sort of reading other people's books. And, like, I don't want that. I just want to hear your thoughts. I don't want to hear your thoughts about other people's books. And I was like, oh God, I'm writing this novel, and all I want it to be is like this guy having art experiences. That's all I want. I just want to make a novel out of somebody who's just looking at art and reading poems and listening to music. So anyway, I knew that I wanted that to be in it. And early on, I don't know. I can't remember now, like, when I realized. So this phrase "small rain" comes from this poem, Western Winds. Western wind, when wilt thou blow? The small rain down can rain. Christ, that my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again. which I think is just such a beautiful poem. You know, it's a poem I've known ever since I've been a literary person, and it's always represented to me kind of this sort of infinite mysteriousness of poetry because it's very hard to parse that poem. It's so simple, and yet it's very hard to sort of paraphrase it. You can't paraphrase it. And so it has to stay a poem, and you know, you have to engage with its meaningfulness in this borderland between sense and nonsense. And it's also very famously a song. The poem dates from, well, the poem is in Middle English and so is earlier than the song. The tune, I think most people think, comes from the 16th century. And then it became that tune. It was a very popular song. And in a moment when a lot of sacred music was being written like on top of secular song melodies, this composer John Tavener. There are lots of Western wind masses, but the one that I know best is this composer John Tavener wrote a Western wind mass, and that was something I studied in school and sang in school, and I make it something that my narrator studies and sings in school. And it becomes a point of contact. So much of this book is about caregivers and especially about nurses. And the first really significant interaction he has with a nurse is with this nurse in the emergency room nurse, who's this guy named Frank. And the poem becomes a way for them to have a sort of full human interaction. And that felt really important. And, you know, I don't remember, it was early in the book because the first section was the first section I wrote. I don't remember at what point in writing I realized, I wonder if I have the notes scrawled down somewhere. You know, in my notebooks, I write on one side of the page and leave the other page blank. And that's because if something occurs to me, like, oh, there needs to be a moment where Western Wind appears, I'll write it. I should go through the notebooks and see if I have that. But it is really important. And in a way, I think you're right that the whole book maps onto that. You know, it only appears once. And yet it's so important to me, that second half of the poem, Christ, that my love were in my arms and I in my bed again. At the very end of the book, the narrator gets to return to the place he has longed for more than any other place while he's been in the ICU, which is his bedroom in his bed that he shares with his partner. And in the moment that he sort of hesitates to relish the experience of getting to get into bed again with the person he loves. He doesn't explicitly reference the poem, but my hope is that the reader will hear that poem. And so the poem is like a canopy over the whole book. So I'm glad that you saw that. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. I have another question. This is from Paul Browdy. Hi, Paul. The PET scan scene was one of the most memorable reading experiences I've had. I had a panic attack during an MRI, and when I read it, I began to panic. I had to bifurcate my consciousness to remind myself that I was reading and that this was not happening to me or even to him in that moment. I'm curious about whether the telling of his story has had some healing effect for you, or did you have to separate yourself from his experience to protect yourself?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a really hard question. Um, you know, a lot of the book is fabulated. I did have a PET scan, but I did not have the kind of panic attack my narrator had. But it certainly is true that writing this book was hard, and reading the book for me is hard. And I know that reading the book, you know, it's interesting, I've gotten sort of more messages about this book from readers than my other books. And I know that some readers who have, well, both readers who have been through similar experiences themselves, and then also even more people who have cared for people undergoing these kinds of experiences. A lot of the book is about the partner, L, and what he undergoes in this period. That it can be a difficult reading experience for them too. So thank you Thank you for sticking with it. That question sort of, I mean, in a deep sense, yes, I do think art is therapeutic in the sense that, these crazy things happen to us and make us utterly subject and powerless. And in making art, just in putting a shape onto them, we reclaim some of our sense of agency. That's true. On the other hand, you know, I don't think having written the book, if in some sense, as I said at the beginning, like I want to write this book because I feel bewildered and I want to not feel bewildered anymore, that has not happened. I do still feel utterly bewildered by, just confronting this great banality that, I live in an animal body that will die. Um, that is still a devastating and terrifying fact for me. Um, so yes and no. I mean, I feel so grateful every day that I have art as a tool to help me live with the experience of being a radically vulnerable contingent being. And that I have art as something that does allow me to feel that I have access to a sort of source of meaning and meaningfulness. I feel very grateful to that, but it is not a cure for, existential terror and dread, alas.
Alas. Um, I I don't even know. I would like, there's more questions in the chat. I have more questions, and also we only have 2 minutes left. Um, one question that I wanted to add, and maybe it's possible this might be a quickie, but also helpful perhaps for the any aspiring writers in the room. I've heard you speak before in talking and teaching about sex writing. If I'm not misquoting you, I believe the quote is logistics are sexy, in the sense of uh, not being afraid to actually like show people like actually doing things and moving one way and then there's a corresponding moving in the other direction and like actually nuts and bolts of how things happen. And I was thinking about that a lot rereading this book because there's so much detail around like quote unquote boring like medical stuff like and then the IV bag went here and the putting the all so much. But I wanted to just quickly ask if that same if you feel the same way about like logistics of you know putting a what are those what's it called the pick line
Yeah, right.
if that's just take it away from there. I won't ask any more questions.
Yeah, I mean, look, that is the project of the book. The project of the book was to try to capture the texture of existence in the ICU. Like that was something that felt really interesting to me, something that I felt like I had not really encountered in books, like what it feels like to be a patient, the way that time becomes weird. Um, and, I certainly knew, I mean, look, it is never my ambition, and I don't think it's ever the ambition of serious art to be for everybody. And, there are certainly people who feel alienated by the level of detail in the book. And then there are also people who are really drawn in by and captivated by the level of detail in the book. And that's fine. I think one of the best things about books as a technology is that they're so easy to close. Like if a book isn't for you, you could just set it aside and pick up another book. But that was the project. The project was, yes, to try to really put you in it in a kind of dense, thick way. And I do think logistics are sexy. And that also, kind of like the narrator thinks about Cezanne, all those brushstrokes trying to capture how light glances off the edge of a plate, that is in some sense the morality of art making, to try to be faithful to a reality that you're putting on the page. and to try to be exact, and in some sense to try to be exhaustive. And that there are a million ways to do that. I think minimalists can do that, maximalists can do that. But that as a goal, I mean, to try to put existence on the page, that's what I'm after and what all of those little logistical details are after.
Thank you. Perfectly put. I appreciate it. And I'm sure if people in the room have not already read this book, that I hope you will have been convinced by now to read it. I'm really just, I don't know how fast the time has gone, and I truly could talk to you for many more hours. I only got through half my questions, and I'm barely even got to hear from the audience, but I will let you go because we only told you to stay for an hour. So thank you,
Okay.
Garth. Thank you so
Thank you
much for
all.
being here. Thank you all for being with us, engaging as always with literature and thoughts. And I hope you will read the book and let us know your thoughts. Yes. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking. Thank you, Garth, as
Thank
always.
you all so much. A pleasure. Thank you.